The lighthouse at Black Hollow Cove had stood against the raging sea for over a century. Though its keeper had long since vanished, the lantern atop its spiraling tower continued to glow, a pale, eerie light that never dimmed. No one tended to it, yet it never failed to shine, even when the storms rolled in. Ethan Moore had spent his childhood in the town just beyond the cove, listening to whispered warnings from the elders about the lighthouse. They spoke of vanished sailors, ghostly figures in the windows, and a keeper who had never left, even in death. Ethan never paid much attention to ghost stories, but when his research on maritime legends led him back to his hometown, curiosity got the best of him. Determined to unravel the mystery, Ethan stood at the base of the lighthouse, the salty wind biting at his skin. The door was ajar, creaking slightly with the wind. Hesitation clawed at the back of his mind, but he pushed forward. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something rotten. Dust floated in the narrow beam of his flashlight as he moved through the small entryway. The walls were lined with old, rusted tools and faded logbooks. As he flipped through the brittle pages of a journal left on a wooden table, a single phrase was scrawled repeatedly in jagged handwriting. "Do not listen to the whispers." Ethan's breath hitched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A distant sound echoed from above, a whisper, soft and indecipherable, like wind rushing through a crack. Heart pounding, he ascended the narrow, spiraling staircase, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. The whispering grew louder, still unintelligible, but undeniably there. He reached the top, stepping into the lantern room. The enormous glass panes rattled in their frames, reflecting the cold glow of the eternal light. The whispering had stopped. Silence pressed in. Then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw it, an outline standing behind him. A gaunt face, hollow eyes staring into his own. Ethan whirled around, but the room was empty. His own reflection, pale and shaken, was the only thing staring back. But just as he was about to breathe, the whisper returned, right behind him. "Why did you come back?" Ethan spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The lantern room was empty, no sign of the figure he had seen in the reflection. The whisper still echoed in his ears, the words chilling his spine. "Why did you come back?" The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. He took a step back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam landed on an old, dust-covered desk pushed against the wall. Papers were scattered across its surface, yellowed with time. He picked one up, his hands unsteady. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "To whoever finds this, I was the last keeper of this lighthouse. The light must never go out. It is the only thing keeping them at bay. But they whisper, always whisper, waiting for the moment I falter. I don't know how much longer I can resist. If you hear them, do not answer." A gust of wind rattled the glass panes, and the whispering returned. This time, it was not just one voice, it was many. Soft, overlapping murmurs, some pleading, some angry. Ethan clenched his teeth, resisting the urge to listen. Then, something shifted in the shadows. The reflection in the glass changed. The room looked the same, but in the reflection, the door behind him was wide open. But in reality, the door was shut. A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's skin. He turned slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. The door remained closed, yet in the reflection, a figure stood in the open doorway. Tall, unmoving, its face hidden in darkness. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. He turned back to the reflection. The figure had stepped closer. Then, a sharp knock echoed through the room. 3 steady knocks. The lantern flickered. The whispering became a frantic hiss. "Let us in." Ethan stumbled back against the desk, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The reflection warped, twisting unnaturally as the figure's shadow lengthened across the room. Then, the lantern's glow surged, casting everything in a blinding white light. The whispering stopped. The room fell deathly silent. When Ethan blinked, the reflection was normal again. The door was closed. The figure was gone. But on the desk, the journal had flipped to a new page. For words were scrawled across it in jagged, desperate strokes. "They are watching you. Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. And for the first time, he truly wished he had never come. Ethan grabbed the journal and shoved it into his backpack, his fingers trembling. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned away from the desk. The air in the lantern room was suffocating, thick with a strange, electric tension. The lighthouse had stood abandoned for years, so why did it feel like something had been waiting for him? He needed to leave. Now. With careful steps, he moved toward the spiral staircase that wound down the tower's core. His flashlight flickered as he shined it down, revealing the rusted iron railing and the endless descent into darkness. A sudden gust rattled the lantern glass above him, but there was no wind inside. Then, the whispering started again. Soft, almost imperceptible, like voices speaking from just beyond the range of human hearing. Ethan gritted his teeth, trying to ignore them. He stepped onto the first stair, wincing as it creaked beneath his weight. The whispers grew louder. Step by step, he made his way down, the stale air growing colder as he descended. His flashlight struggled to cut through the gloom, the beam flickering like a dying candle. His fingers brushed the corroded railing, and for a split second, he swore he felt something move beneath his grip, like a pulse, slow and rhythmic. Then, a noise stopped him cold. A footstep. Not his own. From above. His breath hitched. He turned his flashlight upward, aiming toward the lantern room he had just left. The light caught the edges of the iron railing, the wooden door at the top still firmly shut. Another footstep. Closer. A deep chill ran down his spine. Someone, or something, was following him. Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs as he quickened his pace. The steps beneath him groaned with each hurried footfall, the lighthouse amplifying the sound until it felt like the entire structure was groaning in protest. Then, just as he reached the halfway point, a loud creak directly behind him. The sound of weight shifting. Ethan froze. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. The whispers had stopped. The air was heavy with an unbearable silence. He forced himself to turn. The stairs above were empty. The railing was still. But something was wrong. The flashlight beam wavered, revealing a single, chilling detail. One of the stairs, just 3 steps above him, was pressed down slightly, like someone was standing there. And then, slowly, it began to rise. Like an unseen foot was lifting away. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as the step returned to its normal position. The meaning was clear. Something had been right behind him. And it had just taken another step forward. Without thinking, Ethan bolted down the remaining stairs, his legs burning as he stumbled onto the lower level. He spun, expecting to see something rushing after him. Nothing. But he wasn't fooled. He wasn't alone in the lighthouse. And whatever was with him, it wasn't finished yet. Ethan's chest heaved as he reached the bottom of the staircase. The heavy silence pressed in around him, thick and unnatural. His flashlight beam trembled as he swung it across the main level of the lighthouse. The wooden floor was warped from years of neglect, the salt air having gnawed at it like an unseen beast. His only way out was the entrance door at the far end of the room. It stood partially open, just as he had left it. He sprinted for it. A loud bang echoed behind him, the sound of something striking metal. He nearly tripped as he whirled around. The stairway above was still empty, but something was different. The whispers had returned. No, not whispers. A single voice now. Hoarse. Breathy. Like it was speaking through clenched teeth. Don't leave. Ethan's heart lurched, but his survival instincts kicked in. He spun back toward the exit, his boots pounding against the floor as he reached for the door. And it slammed shut. The sound was deafening. Dust burst from the door frame as it shook in place. Ethan's fingers clawed at the knob, twisting it hard. Locked. No. He yanked. Pulled. Slammed his shoulder against the wood. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged in his veins. He turned, his breath ragged. His flashlight caught the edge of something moving, something shifting in the shadows near the base of the staircase. No. Not something. Someone. A figure stood there, unmoving. Ethan's throat went dry. His flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely illuminating the shape. It was a man, or what used to be one. His form was draped in rotting clothing, his skin waxy and grey. But it was the eyes that made Ethan's stomach twist. They weren't there. Just hollow, gaping sockets staring straight at him. The figure took a step forward. Ethan stumbled back, pressing himself against the locked door. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. He had read about the lighthouse's history, how the last keeper, Victor Halloway, had disappeared nearly a century ago. But there was no record of a body ever being found. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. He could almost make out words now, broken, fragmented sentences. The light must stay on. Trapped, forever. Join us. Ethan's fingers fumbled in his pocket. The key. The one he had found in the lantern room's desk. He yanked it out and shoved it into the lock, twisting desperately. A click. The door burst open. Cold night air rushed in, slamming against his skin like a wave of ice. Without looking back, Ethan ran, bolting across the rocky terrain, his lungs burning. He didn't stop until he reached the path leading back to town. Only then did he dare glance back at the lighthouse. The lantern room was lit. A faint, eerie glow pulsed from the top of the tower, illuminating the night like a ghostly beacon. But Ethan knew the truth. There was no electricity in the lighthouse. No working lamp. So whatever had turned on that light, it wasn't human. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of the rocky path, his breath visible in the cold night air. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The abandoned lighthouse, lifeless for decades, now pulsed with an eerie glow from its lantern room. He wanted to turn away, to run back to town, but something held him there. A whisper, not from inside the lighthouse this time, but in his own mind. A voice that wasn't his own. You saw me. Ethan's stomach twisted. You shouldn't have seen me. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he forced himself to step backward, one foot after the other. He needed to get out of here. The town wasn't far. If he could just. The wind howled, and suddenly, the world shifted. The trees lining the path twisted like shadows stretching unnaturally. The rocks beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the ground itself was shifting. Ethan blinked hard. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. Turn back, the voice slithered through his thoughts again. He whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. But the path was empty. Then, from the direction of the lighthouse, came the slow creak of a door opening. Ethan turned just in time to see the lighthouse's entrance swing wide, the darkness inside yawning like a hungry mouth. And then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Something, or someone, was coming down the steps. Ethan gritted his teeth. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The air around him grew thick, suffocating. The only sound was the steady tap, tap, tap of unseen feet descending the staircase within the lighthouse. Then, it stopped. Silence. A shape emerged from the darkness. At first, it looked like a man. Tall, gaunt, wearing what might have once been a lighthouse keeper's uniform. But as the figure stepped further into the pale moonlight, Ethan saw the truth. It wasn't just any man. It was Victor Halloway, the missing keeper. His face was pale, sunken, as if the years had drained the life from him but refused to let him rest. His eyes, or the hollow spaces where they should have been, fixed on Ethan. A raspy voice scraped against the air. The light must stay on. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Victor took another step forward, and the air around him seemed to warp, distorting reality itself. The lantern room's glow pulsed brighter, casting long, unnatural shadows. Ethan couldn't breathe. If the light goes out, we all go with it. The moment those words left the keeper's lips, the lighthouse shuddered. The glow from the lantern room flickered. And in that brief moment of darkness, Ethan saw them. Hundreds of figures. Lurking in the shadows behind Victor. Twisted faces. Hollow eyes. Waiting. And then, the light went out. A guttural whisper swarmed around Ethan, filling his ears, his mind, his very soul. Darkness swallowed everything. Ethan's scream barely left his lips before the world plunged into utter blackness. The wind howled through the cliffs, carrying whispers that coiled around him like unseen tendrils. The lighthouse had gone dark, completely, unnaturally dark. He staggered backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in frantic, overlapping murmurs. He let it go out. The keeper failed. Now we are free. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing his breath to steady. He turned toward where the lighthouse stood, except, now, it didn't. The massive stone structure was still there, but its shape seemed wrong, twisted. The walls pulsed like something alive, the metal railing along the lantern room rusted and broken, as though decades had passed in an instant. And Victor Halloway was gone. In his place, shadows slithered from the lighthouse's open doorway, moving unnaturally across the ground. They had no source, no solid form, just writhing black figures creeping closer. Ethan took a step back, but his heel caught on a jagged rock. He tumbled onto the damp earth, his palms scraping against the rough ground. The whispers changed, turning to something worse. Laughter. Cold, rasping, inhuman laughter. Then, fingers. Ice-cold, skeletal fingers brushed against his ankle. Ethan kicked wildly, scrambling backward as something unseen tried to pull him closer. His pulse roared in his ears. He had to get out of here. He had to run. But the lighthouse door loomed open, and a voice, deep and guttural, echoed from within. Come and see. A gust of wind slammed into him, and suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. Ethan plunged into darkness. The fall felt endless, yet it lasted only seconds. He landed hard on something damp and uneven. The smell of salt and decay choked him. He groaned, pushing himself up, his hands sinking into something cold and wet. The lighthouse should have been above him. But as he looked up, there was no sign of the entrance, no hole in the ground. Just endless black stone walls, slick with moisture. He wasn't outside anymore. He was somewhere beneath the lighthouse. A long, narrow tunnel stretched ahead, lined with old, rusted lanterns that flickered weakly. Faint etchings covered the stone walls, symbols that pulsed with a dim red glow. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the scent of something ancient. And in the distance, footsteps. Slow. Wet. Approaching. Ethan turned, his breath caught in his throat. Something was moving toward him. Not Victor. Not a ghost, something older. Something that had been waiting. A figure loomed at the tunnel's end, its form shifting and unnatural. It had no face, no distinct shape, just a mass of darkness that pulsed with hunger. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run. But then, from behind him, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Ethan. His blood ran cold. It was his sister's voice. The sister who had died 10 years ago. Ethan froze. His breath hitched as his sister's voice echoed through the damp tunnel. Ethan. Why did you leave me? It was impossible. Emma had been gone for 10 years. He had been there, had seen the water swallow her, had spent countless nights haunted by the memory. But the voice was unmistakable. Slowly, he turned toward the source. The tunnel stretched into the darkness, the flickering lanterns barely illuminating the jagged stone walls. At the very edge of the dim light, a silhouette stood motionless. Small. Frail. Ethan's chest tightened. Emma. His own voice barely sounded like his own. The figure took a step forward. The lantern's glow caught pale, wet skin. Tangled. Dripping hair. Eyes that were too wide, too empty. You didn't save me. Ethan's stomach churned. His legs locked in place, torn between the desperate hope that it was somehow real, and the primal terror clawing at his gut. I tried, he whispered. His throat burned with guilt, the same guilt that had never left him since that night at Hollow Peak's shoreline. The figure's head twitched. The wet strands of hair clung to its face as it stepped closer. Liar. Ethan stumbled backward. He had to move. He had to get out of here. But the tunnel stretched endlessly behind him, the air growing thicker with every breath. Then, Another sound. The slow, wet footsteps from before. Something else was coming. Ethan turned his head, and his stomach dropped. The figure at the far end of the tunnel had moved closer. It no longer shifted like a shadow. It had shape now. A twisted, elongated body, arms that stretched unnaturally long, fingers that scraped the stone walls as it advanced. Its face was still obscured, shifting like liquid darkness. But its eyes were hollow pits, blacker than the void itself. Ethan's pulse pounded. He was trapped. "Come with me, Ethan," the thing whispered, reaching out a pale, bloated hand. "Join me." The shadow behind him let out a sound, a deep, guttural inhale. Like it was smelling him. Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't his sister. This wasn't her voice. It was the lighthouse. The thing inside it. It was playing with him, twisting his grief into something it could use. And he wasn't going to let it. With a sharp breath, Ethan spun on his heel and ran. The tunnel walls blurred as he sprinted forward, the flickering lanterns casting long, warped shadows. The whispers rose into frantic shrieks behind him, inhuman and enraged. Something lashed out, cold fingers brushing his arm. He wrenched away, pushing himself faster. Up ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. One descended deeper into the darkness. The other, a faint glimmer of light. A way out. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the light, his legs screaming in protest. The air behind him shifted, the thing chasing him surging forward, just as he reached the tunnel's end and threw himself through. He landed hard on wet stone, gasping. The air was different here, cold, but not suffocating. The whispers had stopped. Slowly, he lifted his head. He was inside a massive cavern. And in the center, surrounded by water, stood something impossible, a door. Old. Rusted. Carved with symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. And worst of all, it was slightly open. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the door. It stood in the center of the cavern, half submerged in dark, rippling water. The rusted metal frame was covered in symbols, some etched, some carved so deep they looked like wounds in the metal. They pulsed faintly, like something was breathing beneath them. The door was slightly ajar. A soft creaking noise echoed through the cavern, barely audible over Ethan's own heartbeat hammering in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to run. But his body wouldn't move. "Come closer," the whisper slithered through the air, curling around his mind like fingers pressing into his skull. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew that voice. It wasn't Emma anymore. It was something older, hungrier. Something from the lighthouse. He took a step forward, compelled by something he couldn't name. The moment his foot touched the wet stone near the water's edge, the cavern trembled. A low groan rumbled from the walls, dust shaking loose from above. The water rippled outward from the door, its surface distorting like something massive was shifting just beneath it. Ethan swallowed hard. The door wasn't just sitting there, it was keeping something in. He turned to run, but a cold hand gripped his wrist. Ethan's stomach twisted in horror. The fingers were thin, impossibly long, with skin stretched so tight over the bones it looked mummified. Slowly, he turned his head. The figure standing beside him was barely human. Its face was gaunt, stretched unnaturally over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were empty sockets, blacker than the deepest part of the sea. Its mouth hung slightly open, revealing a row of uneven, jagged teeth. But worst of all, it was wearing a tattered lighthouse keeper's uniform. The thing's grip tightened, its fingers digging into Ethan's flesh. "You don't belong here," it whispered, voice layered, like it wasn't one voice, but many speaking at once. Ethan tried to yank his arm free, but the thing didn't budge. It was strong, too strong. Behind him, the door let out another groan. The gap widened. A flood of freezing air poured into the cavern, carrying the stench of salt and decay. The water surrounding the door began to churn violently, as if something was rising from beneath it. A single, massive hand gripped the edge of the door. The fingers were gnarled and bloated, skin torn and dripping. Blackened nails scraped against the rusted metal, sending a horrible screech through the cavern. Ethan's chest seized with panic. Something was coming through. The lighthouse keeper's hollow eyes stared into his. "You must close it." Ethan shook his head wildly. I don't know how." The keeper's head twitched. "Then it will take you instead." A deep, guttural growl rumbled from behind the door. The hand pulled itself further through. Ethan knew he had only seconds to act. Ignoring the ice-cold fear gripping his spine, he wrenched his arm from the keeper's grasp and lunged for the door. His hands slammed against the corroded metal, pushing with everything he had. The door resisted. Another hand emerged. A second later, something massive and bloated pressed against the gap, an indistinct face, twisted and rotting, eyes that burned with something far worse than malice. It opened its mouth. And the whisper that escaped wasn't a voice. It was hunger. Ethan screamed and shoved harder. The lighthouse keeper moved beside him, skeletal hands grasping the door's edge. Together, they pushed. The cavern groaned. The water roared. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek as the door slammed shut, and everything went silent. Ethan stumbled back, chest heaving. The keeper was gone. The cavern was still. But the symbols on the door, they were still pulsing. Ethan stood frozen, his trembling hands still pressed against the rusted door. His breath fogged in the damp air, each exhale shaky and uneven. The cavern was silent now, but the weight of what had just happened crushed down on him. The symbols on the door continued to pulse faintly, like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. Then, a whisper, soft, nearly lost in the cavern's stillness. "You must finish it." Ethan spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lighthouse keeper stood a few feet away, his emaciated form barely more than a shadow in the dim light. His hollow eye sockets were fixed on Ethan, the empty void somehow filled with an unbearable weight. Ethan swallowed hard. What was that thing?" The keeper's head tilted slightly. "A mistake. A hunger that should never have been fed." Ethan shuddered. He didn't want to know what that meant. He turned back to the door. His fingers traced the deep carvings, the unnatural symbols that seemed to breathe under his touch. He could feel it, something behind the door, waiting. Trapped. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The lighthouse keeper didn't answer immediately. Then, "Not yet." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The keeper took a step forward. "The door is closed, but it is not sealed. It will weaken. And when it does," he didn't need to finish. Ethan already knew. The thing, whatever it was, would return. Ethan clenched his fists. "Then tell me how to stop it." The keeper raised one skeletal hand and pointed upward. "The lighthouse." Ethan hesitated. He had come here searching for Emma, desperate to find some explanation for her disappearance. Instead, he had found something much worse, an ancient, festering horror locked behind a door that should never have existed. And now he was being told the answer was back where it all began. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Fine," he said. "Tell me what I need to do." The keeper's form flickered for a moment, like a candle's flame struggling against the wind. Then, in a voice that was not just his own, but layered with echoes of something older, he spoke. "Light the flame. Banish the shadow. End the cycle." Ethan frowned. What flame? But the keeper was already fading, his form dissolving into the darkness. The cavern trembled slightly, and for the first time, Ethan noticed the water was beginning to rise. He didn't have much time. Turning away from the cursed door, he sprinted back through the winding passage, his mind racing. He didn't know what awaited him in the lighthouse, only that it was the final step. The end of everything. Or the beginning of something far worse. Ethan emerged from the underground tunnel, gasping for air as the cold night wind whipped across his face. The cavern behind him trembled. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he could feel the thing behind the door pressing against reality, desperate to break free. There was no time to waste. The lighthouse stood before him, its once majestic frame now a towering ruin against the stormy sky. The beacon at the top remained lifeless, swallowed by the dark. But Ethan knew, somehow, he had to relight it. Light the flame. Banish the shadow. End the cycle, the keeper's final words echoed in his mind as he forced himself forward, ignoring the screaming ache in his legs. He threw open the rusted door and rushed inside. The interior was even more decayed than before. The walls dripped with moisture, and the wooden steps creaked under his weight as he ascended. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the spiral staircase, moving like living things, watching him. Whispers slithered through the air. "You don't belong here. Turn back. You will fail." Ethan gritted his teeth and climbed faster. He would not stop now. As he reached the top, he found the lantern room in complete disarray. The massive lens was cracked, and the mechanisms that once powered the light lay in rusted pieces. But in the center of it all, resting atop a stone pedestal, was an old oil lamp, small, simple, and untouched by time. This was the flame. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but the moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, a force rushed through him. He gasped as visions flooded his mind, memories that were not his own. The first lighthouse keeper, standing exactly where he stood now, holding the same lamp, whispering an incantation to keep the darkness at bay. The decades that followed, each keeper chosen to relight the flame before the hunger below could escape, the year it was forgotten. The year the cycle was broken. Emma's disappearance had been no accident. The thing in the cavern had reached for her, needed her. And if Ethan failed now, it would take more than just her, it would consume everything. Summoning every last shred of strength, Ethan struck a match and touched it to the wick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, whoomph! The flame roared to life, impossibly bright. The entire lighthouse shook as a wave of golden light burst from the tower, cutting through the storm, sweeping across the island. Ethan shielded his eyes as the shadows recoiled, screaming, vanishing into the light. Deep below, in the cavern, the ancient door sealed shut. The whispers stopped. And just like that, the lighthouse stood silent once more. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged, his body shaking. It was over. Or at least, until the flame needed to be lit again.